Welcome back. So today we're going to talk about number 6 on our 7 most important tools for modern WordPress developers. This is the WordPress REST API. So WordPress comes bundled with a REST API, and it's actually extremely important that it does because the REST API is what enables tools like Gutenberg and the block editor to even exist. Because instead of just doing everything in PHP and constantly having to reload the page and run all that PHP again, the REST API lets you use JavaScript or even another site to talk to WordPress, get some data, update some data. And in the process, yes, PHP is running, to power the REST API, but you can actually do it through JavaScript, through, Ajax requests, all these sorts of things. At the end of the day, it's very similar to WP query in that you build a query and you fetch some data from WordPress, but it just is a lot more powerful than that. And like I said, it's a two-way connection. So it actually handles things like updating content, updating settings, all that sort of stuff. So the REST API is something you really want to pay attention to. One of the quickest ways to see an example of an action is literally to load the block editor. So I've pulled up my local WordPress website and I've actually logged into the site editor. And so the site editor is part of Gutenberg. It's part of the block editor package. And this is a piece of JavaScript that sits on top of your WordPress site and it does things like change content and stuff without having to reload the page. So that REST API powers its ability to do a bunch of stuff, in the client's browser and then communicate back to WordPress. So what I did is I pulled open the network tab in our developer tools, and then you can see here all of these requests that it made. And these are all different endpoints in the WordPress REST API because that's how it's getting all of its information. So there's endpoints for getting information about the user, for getting information about all the block patterns that you have, getting information about all the pages on your site, all the different categories, things like that. So all these different endpoints can get that information, and then you can send updates back to those endpoints and change the data the same way you would if you were doing it in PHP. One of the good things about the REST API is it's still built in the standard WordPress way, meaning if you edit a post using the REST API and you have plugins that have all these functions that run when a post is being updated, it's still going to run all that stuff because it's still running all the PHP under the hood and it's still doing all the different stuff. It's just this extra layer on top that lets you get a little bit more interactive. So it's pretty powerful, but it doesn't, change the way we used to do things in WordPress. It actually just builds on top of it. Okay, so I'm pulling up a tool called Postman. This is just a free app. There's probably a premium version of it, but it's really great for exploring kind of REST APIs, seeing what endpoints can do, and that sort of stuff. So this is my local site right here, wpdev.local, and all of the REST API sits at this wp/JSON endpoint, and from there, there's all different paths that we can take. So this one under the main WordPress version 2, because there was an earlier version of the REST API, and then posts. And this is how I run this as a get command and I get all the posts on my site. I can get all this information about them. I get all this like stuff from like Yoast SEO. I get all sorts of links and other different endpoints to get more information. I get the URLs, I get the title, the content, all this sort of stuff. So it's really just full access to the content of your site. Now, in this case, this is public and anybody can really go to any WordPress site and you can run this. And it's the same as if you were to scrape it off the site or if you were to get it through an RSS feed. But there are some endpoints that are private. So, for example, there's an endpoint for settings. And if I try to run that, I'm going to get, you're not allowed to do that. So you can't go to any WordPress site and hit its API endpoint to get its settings, but you can pass it some authorization. There's a tool called application passwords. I have a video just explaining exactly how to do this. Then when you send that request, you'll actually get all of that information from WordPress because you've authorized it. And so when you're writing code on a WordPress site, you usually don't even have to think about this because it authenticates everything for you, but you can actually build tools, and a lot of plugins do, where you can communicate with people's WordPress sites via the REST API, and you can use these application passwords to send and receive information back. So it's a super powerful tool and it's very handy. And especially if you want to start using the block editor, you really do want to start understanding some of the core endpoints, how they work, how the queries work, how they're a little bit different than kind of old school WP query. Then let's talk about the superpower of the WordPress REST API, which is you can actually build your own endpoints to do things like send and receive your own data for your plugins. So I'm back in my custom block plugin. You can see that we've added a little bit more code. And what we're doing here is we're actually registering our own REST API endpoint. So this is going to be our own URL wp-dev/v1, and it's going to have its own different endpoint. This one we're just calling example. And then you can do things like say what the function is that's actually going to run. So we've created this function called example response, and it's just going to return a string or an array with a string that says hello world. But you can do write your own code. You can also pass parameters in the request, so you can basically have filters and stuff on the URL, or query parameters, those sorts of things. And then you can actually do things like add security callbacks. You can say, well, only allow this if the user is an admin, or only allow this if the user is an author, or something like that. So there's all sorts of security built in. You don't even have to think about it. You can just use it, and then you can use all the functions to return your own endpoint. So with this, 20 lines of code, we've written our own REST API endpoint. Let's take a look at what it does when I run it in Postman. Okay, so I'm back in Postman, and now I'm calling my own JSON endpoint that we just looked at, wp-dev/v1/example. I'm going to make a GET request to it. I'm going to run it, and it sends me back my string hello world inside of an array. So this is just kind of like giving you a really simple example, but the REST API is the way that you're going to communicate with a WordPress website, especially if you're using the block editor. So if you're using any custom post types, anything like that, it's all handled for you out of the box. You don't even really have to think about it. Core WordPress settings, custom fields, custom post types, all that stuff, they're all going to just work, and you're not going to have to write code for them. But if you are going to get a little bit fancy, you can write your own endpoints and do all sorts of things to put data into the block editor, make your plugin super interactive, all that sort of stuff. So WP REST API, it's very critical, and there's no way you're going to start working the block editor without looking at it over and over, I promise you. So that is our number 6 tool, the WordPress REST API. Join me next time for number 7 on our 7 most important tools for modern WordPress developers.